have been wrong before while feeling completely and utterly certain? I mean, completely, not just a little bit wrong, but significantly wrong about something that actually mattered to you. Now, think of a specific time. Somebody pushed back on a decision you had already made. And before they even finished their sentence, something inside you snapped and you closed and you knew. And it was not just a thought, but you knew completely that they were missing something, that you had the full picture and they simply didn't. And then at some point later, you had to see that it was actually you who had missed something. And I think we've all been there. I know I definitely have. And it's not because we're careless or because we're stupid. It is because our brains, they generate feelings of certainty through a process that has absolutely nothing to do with whether the conclusion is actually correct or false. And that process is running right now in the background in the strategy you stopped questioning a few weeks ago, in the read or belief you have in a person or situation that feels completely settled in your mind. And the question is not whether or not it's running, because it is. The question here is, which of your current certainties does it explain? I'm Gwen Bach, and I have a master's degree in applied neuroscience, and I'm the founder of Applied Brain Lab, where I study how modern environments shape decision-making in ambitious professionals and business owners. So here is what this video will give you. First, the neuroscience of what a feeling of rightness actually matters, and why it is not what most people think. And second, the mechanism that takes that feeling and builds a very convincing case around it. Essentially, it is using your own reasoning against you. And third, a practical tool, and maybe you know by now, I like practical tools that you can use to find the gap between what feels right and what reality, what evidence actually supports. So let's get into that. So that feeling, so let's start with what a feeling of insight actually is. When a problem suddenly resolves, or when an answer arrives, and it just feels so right, so correct, your brain generates what researchers call a feeling of rightness. Now, that's a very measurable metacognitive signal. And metacognition just means thinking about thinking. It's simply the layer of the brain's processing that monitors and evaluates its own activity. And a feeling of rightness is one of the primary outputs of that monitoring layer. So here's what's really important to understand. A feeling of rightness, and this feeling, it is not generated by having found the actual truth, the actual correct answer. It is generated by something called processing fluency. And that means the speed and ease by which a thought comes together in your mind. So when associations connect quickly, when an idea flows without resistance, when something just clicks, the brain interprets that ease as a signal of truth. And this is the fluency heuristic. And what that means in practice is that our brains use ease as a processing substitute for accuracy. Because our brain, we're not able to check whether a conclusion is true or not, because we can't see into the future. And this has been tested directly by Stuart Risico and Fugelsang, published in 2023 in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, showing that what drives that feeling of rightness is specifically the speed by which an answer is generated internally. Not what happens afterward, but that moment when the answer comes to mind. So the faster and the more smoothly that happens, the stronger that feeling of rightness is. And the stronger the feeling, the less likely you are to reflect further, or we are willing to reconsider. So that feeling of certainty and the absence of further thinking, questioning, they arrive together. And accuracy does not determine this, fluency does. Now, this makes sense when you think about this from an evolutionary perspective. For most of our human history, familiarity and fast processing information was very reliable information. So if something felt fluent, that was because you had actually encountered it before and it had been accurate before. So what actually was reasonable, a very reasonable shortcut for us for a very, very long time in our history. But today, in our modern, fast professional environments, where you are processing large volumes of information every day, your cognitive load is already up here and your decisions follow after decisions without much recovery time in between. The things that process most easily are very often just the things you've already experienced, what you believe, your frameworks, your mental models, conclusions that have been working in the past and have been reinforced over your lifetime. And so fluency in that context does not track truth for us anymore. It tracks familiarity. And familiarity and truth, those are unfortunately not the same thing anymore. And research examining what is called the Eureka heuristic, which is basically the tendency to treat that sudden feeling of insight as a confirmation that something is correct, and shows that false insights can actually be systematically produced under laboratory conditions. Isn't that cool? So the feeling of aha selects ideas based on the subjective experience of coherence and not whether they're actually right. So a conclusion can feel exactly like a breakthrough and can be entirely wrong. So that is the first mechanism. Insight feelings are fluency signals. They measure how well something fits together in your mind and not how true or how well it fits into reality. Now, the second mechanism, and this is where it really compounds. Once a conclusion feels right, the brain does not begin evaluating it, it begins to defend it. And I want to be clear about it. It is not something that just happens to poor thinkers or somebody who is stupid or lazy. This is a structural feature of how human reasoning and how our brains operate. So, and research in what is called the argumentative theory of reasoning, it proposes that the primary function of conscious reasoning is not to actually find accurate conclusion, but it is to construct justifications for conclusions that have already been reached. So reasoning in this model, and this evolved as a tool for social persuasion. Its job is to produce arguments that can be defended and not to produce beliefs that happen to be correct. What this means in practice is that once fluency has generated that sensation of rightness, of course, the reasoning system does not interrogate that conclusion because it's right. It mobilizes behind it and it finds evidence that fits. And evidence that contradicts it gets minimized or reframed or just quietly ignored or set aside. Now, confirmation bias is part of this picture. You've probably heard it before, but it actually sits downstream of that fluency signal. The selectivity in what evidence gets chosen that follow the direction of the original insight feeling. That feeling comes first and the reasoning follows, and then the evidence is recruited to support what the feeling already decided. And here's the part that makes it generally hard to catch. Positive emotional states, and that is the satisfaction of feelings like you understand something, the quiet confidence of certainty, they increase memory fluency and inflate confidence judgments without actually improving accuracy. So the more certain you feel, the more convincingly your reasoning system constructs the supporting case. The certainty deepens the argument, and the argument deepens the certainty, and neither one of those things requires the conclusion to be actually true. What you end up with is something that is internally very coherent and that can withstand the most casual challenges, and that feeling comes from inside, like well-reasoned conviction, and the person holding it is not being dishonest, and they're not cutting corners. They're simply experiencing the genuine product of fluency. Driven insight meeting the argumentative function of reasoning, and it feels like understanding. In important ways, it is not. So, what does this actually look like when it plays out in real life? So let's take an example. Mark runs a SaaS business, so he has a software. 3 years in, 12 people on the team, a product that works really well. 18 months ago, he made a call to focus exclusively on mid-market clients. And it felt strategically completely obvious. His strongest early customers had been mid-market. And his sales data, it supported that insight. And for him, this was a feeling of clarity. And it was very honestly very hard for him to argue with it. So he stopped questioning it. 6 months later, 2 enterprise leads came in without the team even going after them. His salespeople flagged them. And Marcus looked at the criteria, decided that they were outside of his ideal customer persona, and moved on. And the reasoning inside his head was clean. It fit his framework. And at 12 months, a competitor entered the same mid-market with more resources, faster deployment, and his margins started compressing. Mark ran a strategy review, and the conclusion was to hold position, to work on retention, and to wait. The reasoning was clear and coherent, and it was supported by data that had been selected from the available picture of the past. And at month 18, 2 of his best salespeople left. And in their exit conversations, both of them said the same thing. The leads they were being asked to disqualify were exactly the ones they knew how to close. But what Mark heard was that was an execution concern and not a strategic one. And so the framework absorbed the feedback without updating. 2 years later, after the original call, the strategy is still underperforming in ways that no longer have clean explanations, but Mark's reasoning about it is now very sophisticated. He has 2 years of constructed arguments behind it. Every objection that has ever been raised has been addressed, and not because the objections by themselves were wrong, but because the argumentative system found a response each time. The strategy has not been tested, it has been defended. And those two things are not the same thing. So a practical tool that addresses this is not about slowing down your decisions. Slowing down alone it really doesn't help. A slower version of the same process still runs exactly in the same direction. What is needed is a structural interruption that forces your reasoning system, the reasoning system, to run the other way. And there is actually good research behind why this works. Studies on metacognitive training, they consistently show that what reduces fluency-driven errors is not willpower or general caution. It is structured questioning that deliberately activates the part of your thinking that fluency bypasses. You are not fighting the feeling of rightness, you're rooting around it. So take pen and paper for this, not your phone. And I really like pen and paper. And again, not your phone or laptop, because the act of writing by hand introduces processing friction. And that means it slows the fluency signal and forces you to actually construct the thought deliberately rather than just retrieving it. And that friction is not an inconvenience. That friction is the whole point of writing. And this works in 4 steps. Step 1, identify a conclusion you're currently holding on with high confidence, something you've been acting on for maybe weeks or months, where the rightness just feels settled. Write it on the top of your page in one precise sentence, not something vague like my pricing strategy is right. I mean something specific, something like charging at this charging at this price point to this customer segment through this channel is correct given the current market conditions. Because vague conclusions cannot be generally challenged. The precision really matters here. Step 2. Write the strongest possible argument against it. And I mean the strongest one, not just a weak objection you can dismiss in a sentence. The most intelligent, well-evidenced case that a very rigorous person with no investment in your conclusion would actually make. And use the evidence available to you, not what you believe it shows. What could it plausibly show to someone reading it without your prior framework? And you will feel that kind of pull to soften this and to add qualifications that protect the original conclusion, to steer that counter-argument toward ground you can already defend. And that pull, that is the mechanism right there. Notice it. And then write the harder version anyway, like radical honesty here is key. Step 3, ask yourself one question on paper. What evidence would actually change my mind in this? And write it down. And not what would slightly adjust your thinking, what would generally completely shift your conclusion. If you find it difficult to answer that, if nothing solid comes to mind, or even if everything you write feels hypothetical and quite unlikely, that is very important information. And that means that your conclusion has moved out of the territory of evaluation and into the territory of belief. And belief that feel like evidence but don't have the structure of it, that is exactly where fluency-driven errors compound most quietly over time. Step 4. Look at what you produced in steps 2 and 3 and ask one final question. Is this something generally new to me? Or had I actually encountered this evidence before and just moved past it? If the counter-arguments contains evidence you already had access to but did not weigh properly, that is not proof your original conclusion is wrong, but it is evidence that your reasoning has been running in one direction without interruption for long enough that it could not easily run the other way. And that tells you exactly where to look. So what most people find when they do this for the first time is that the counter-argument is more substantial than they expected. Sorry, not because their original conclusion was wrong, and sometimes it can be entirely right. And going through this process gives them kind of the confidence that feels genuinely different from the fluency-driven kind. It feels more grounded, more earned, like you deserve it. But they had not built it themselves. They had inherited it from a feeling. So here's the model that I think holds all of this together. Your brain, it has 2 modes, and that it very regularly conflates. Evaluation and advocacy. So evaluation and advocacy, Evaluation asks, is this actually true? And advocacy asks, how do I make this convincing? And from the other side, they feel almost, or from the inside, they feel almost identical. but produce structured reasoning. Both generate that subjective experience of clarity. Both feel, while they're running, like you're thinking carefully. The difference in what triggers them. Evaluation is triggered by genuine uncertainty, by unresolved questions, by deliberately holding a conclusion open, by an actual willingness to be wrong. Advocacy is triggered by a conclusion that already feels right. And in a high-load professional environment, lots of decisions, dense information, interruptions, cognitive pressure, advocacy runs far more than evaluation does, because advocacy is faster, it's easier, more fluent, and produces the feeling of understanding without requiring the full work of it. And the brain is managing a lot at once in today's world. It defaults to the process that costs less. Remember, your brain is an expensive organ. And evaluation is expensive. Advocacy, on the other hand, is efficient. And over months and years, what it produces is a thinking environment where most of what feels like careful reasoning is actual careful defense. And when the strength of a conviction reflects how long it has been reinforced and not the quality of the evidence behind it. So if you are an ambitious professional or business owner, that gap is not abstract. It is the strategy held 18 months too long. The partnership not examined closely enough, the market assumption that was never seriously stress tested, not from a lack of information, but from a reasoning system that was simply running in the wrong direction. And your brain is very good at feeling certain. The question is whether the certainty you're carrying right now was actually built through evaluation, or whether it arrived as a feeling and your reasoning has simply been defending it ever since.